Jonathan Drake's mansion sat on the crest of a rolling hill, its glass walls reflecting the pale winter sun. Inside, the air was crisp and still, every room immaculate, every surface polished to perfection. It was less a home than a museum, its beauty so controlled it left no room for warmth. Staff moved like clockwork, their footsteps soundless on marble floors, their voices hushed as though they feared to disturb the silence that clung to the place like a second skin. In the east wing, behind a closed door, 6-year-old Ethan lay in a bed too large for his small frame. He had not walked, spoken, or laughed in 2 years. Not since the day the lake had claimed his mother and left him with a body that no longer answered his will. His dark hair curled slightly at the ends, his skin pale against the white linens. His eyes, wide and brown, stared up at the ceiling without blinking for long stretches of time, as though he were fixed on something no one else could see. Jonathan was a man of precision and power, a mind that turned companies into empires. In the boardroom, he was unstoppable. At home, he was a shadow passing through rooms he no longer inhabited in spirit. He told himself he worked for Ethan's sake, to keep the future secure. But the truth was simpler and more painful. Facing his son meant facing his own helplessness. He couldn't bring himself to sit at that bedside and see the boy he had once carried on his shoulders, legs pumping in joy, now frozen and silent. The day Clara Bennett arrived, the sun was pale against a sky the color of steel. She stood at the front doors with a single suitcase and a canvas bag worn soft at the edges. In her late 30s, she had the bearing of someone who had weathered storms without letting them break her. Her hair was braided neatly, her posture steady, her gaze calm but attentive. Victoria Hale, the estate manager, led her inside, the click of her heels sharp against the marble. "Your duties are strictly domestic," Victoria said without looking back. "Cleaning, laundry, upkeep of the guest quarters. You will not, under any circumstances, involve yourself with Master Ethan. The nurses and therapists handle his needs. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, her voice low and even. They passed down long corridors lined with art that seemed chosen more for value than beauty. It was in one of these corridors that Clara's gaze was drawn to an open doorway. She slowed without thinking. Inside, a small figure lay on a bed, the room bathed in cold afternoon light. The boy's face was expressionless, his body still beneath a light blanket. Clara didn't know why she stopped. She couldn't explain the tightening in her chest or the way the world seemed to fade into quiet, except for the faint sound of her own breath. Victoria's sharp voice broke the moment. "Keep walking, Bennett. There's nothing for you in there." But as Clara moved on, she carried the image of him with her, the lonely stillness of a child who seemed too young to have learned how to disappear. In the staff kitchen later, she heard them speak about him in lowered voices, how he hadn't moved in months, how therapy sessions passed in silence, how they doubted he'd ever be more than a shadow in that bed. That night, when the hallways were dim and the house had settled into its careful quiet, Clara walked past the east wing. She wasn't trying to disturb him, only moving between rooms on her rounds. Still, the memory of his vacant stare lingered. Without thinking, she began to hum an old gospel tune her grandmother had sung to her as a child, a melody soft and steady, carrying the warmth of long-ago kitchens and summer porches. She reached the end of the hall and paused, her hand resting lightly against the wall. A movement caught her eye. Through the narrow crack of Ethan's open door, she saw it. His head had turned ever so slightly, his gaze no longer fixed on the ceiling but tilted toward the sound. It was the smallest shift, the kind of thing that could be missed if you weren't looking, but Clara saw it, and it rooted her to the spot. For the first time in months, Ethan had reacted to the world around him, and it was to her voice. Clara woke before the winter sun had begun to bleed pale light across the Drake estate. The mansion's walls still held the hush of night, that peculiar stillness that seemed to press down harder here than anywhere else. She dressed quickly in her plain uniform, pulled her braids into a tidy knot, and stepped into the service corridor. Even in the quiet, she could hear the house breathing, faint hums of the heating system, the occasional creak in the old beams. By mid-morning, she had already finished her assigned guest suite and polished the brass railings along the west staircase. She moved without hurry, her mind caught on what she had seen the night before. Ethan's head turning toward her, humming, the faint glimmer of awareness in his gaze. It was the smallest thing, but to Clara, it felt like standing at the mouth of a long-forgotten tunnel and seeing the faintest trace of light far ahead. She found herself lingering near the east wing more often than her schedule required. Sometimes she passed the door slowly, other times she busied herself nearby, dusting frames that didn't need dusting, straightening rugs that were already perfectly aligned. She kept her humming soft, a background thread, as though she were testing the air itself. More than once she thought she caught the subtle flicker of movement in Ethan's eyes, the tiny shift of his head. The nurses noticed too, though they didn't want to admit it. One morning, Patricia, the day nurse, stood by the window making notes on her tablet. Clara was wiping down the sideboard when she saw Ethan's gaze follow her hand, tracking the cloth's movement. Patricia glanced up sharply, saw it, and froze. Coincidence, she muttered, almost to herself before going back to her chart. Later that afternoon, as Clara passed the study, she overheard Victoria speaking to Jonathan in her clipped, businesslike tone. "Sir, I've observed the new maid lingering near Master Ethan's room. I believe she's overstepping." Jonathan's reply was flat. "Tell her to focus on her duties. We don't need distractions." That should have been the end of it, but the memory of Ethan's eyes following her movements haunted Clara through the rest of the day. That evening, with most of the staff gone to their quarters, she walked past his door again. This time she stepped inside. The air was cool, sterile, and faintly scented of antiseptic. Ethan lay as she had first seen him, but his eyes shifted the moment she crossed the threshold. Clara didn't move closer. Instead, she lowered herself into the chair near the window and began to speak in the same calm, steady tone she had used with her own son, Malik, during his long months in the hospital. She told Ethan about a boy who loved cars more than anything else in the world, who had memorized every model, every color. A boy the doctor said would never open his eyes again, but who did. And for 3 months he laughed, played, and defied every prediction before God called him home. As she spoke, she noticed the faintest twitch in Ethan's fingers. She looked down and realized he was reaching, barely but deliberately, toward the small red toy car on his bedside table. Clara glanced at the door, her heartbeat loud in her ears. No one was watching. Slowly, she picked up the car and placed it in his hand. His fingers closed around it, weak but cert, and the sight of it stole her breath. When she left the room, she knew she had just crossed an invisible line. She was no longer just the maid who dusted furniture and kept the silver gleaming. She had stepped into the territory everyone else had abandoned, the place where someone still believed there was something to fight for. What Clara didn't know was that a small security camera in the corner of Ethan's room had caught the moment. In another part of the house, Jonathan Drake was reviewing footage on his laptop. He watched, his jaw tightening, as the black woman he'd barely noticed placed the toy in his son's hand, and his son held on. He closed the screen without finishing the recording, unable or unwilling to decide if what he'd just seen was real. The winter air outside the Drake estate was sharp and biting, but inside the mansion a strange new current had begun to stir. It was small, almost imperceptible, but for those who paid attention, it was there, an echo of life in a house that had been silent for far too long. And at the center of it all was the boy in the East Wing and the woman everyone had underestimated. Ethan's days were supposed to be the same as they'd been for the past 2 years. Quiet, clinical, predictable. The nurses followed their routines with exact precision, recording vitals, administering medication, adjusting his position every few hours. The physical therapist came twice a week, coaxing his legs into mechanical stretches. It was all measured, all controlled, all safe. But Clara Bennett was adding something no one had accounted for: color, movement, and an unspoken challenge that seemed to be drawing Ethan back from wherever he had gone. In the mornings, while she dusted the bookshelf or rearranged the vases on his windowsill, Clara began to hum, not just the old gospel tunes anymore, but fragments of jazz, scraps of childhood lullabies, even silly songs she made up on the spot. At first, the changes were tiny. Ethan's eyes would follow her hand as she wiped down the blinds. His lips twitched when she hummed a particularly ridiculous melody about a dancing chicken. Then one afternoon it happened. Clara was polishing the edge of his dresser when she heard it, a muffled sound, so soft she thought she had imagined it. She turned, her heart thudding, and saw it. The faintest giggle, almost shy, bubbling out of him. It vanished as quickly as it came, but the sound was unmistakable. Patricia, who had been entering notes into her tablet, looked up in shock. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Clara only smiled and went back to her work, but inside her chest something was burning bright. That evening in his upstairs office, Jonathan Drake was scanning his email when Victoria Hale appeared in the doorway, her arms folded tightly. "You should know," she said. "The maid is still interacting with Ethan. Today the boy laughed," Jonathan. "Do you know how that looks? Unlicensed therapy? Emotional manipulation?" Jonathan set his pen down. "Or maybe he just laughed." Victoria's voice sharpened. "If you let her continue, the media will twist it. The board will see it as another sign you're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. And if this progress reverses, it'll destroy you both." Jonathan didn't answer. He didn't have to. In truth, he was torn. He'd seen the footage of Clara placing the toy in Ethan's hand. He'd watched his son's fingers close around it. He wanted to believe. But believing meant opening the door to hope, and hope was dangerous. Hope had failed him before. The next day, the unspoken tension between Clara and Victoria finally broke. It was in the upstairs linen room, the air thick with the scent of freshly laundered sheets. "You think you're here to save him," Victoria said coldly, stepping close enough that her air fume stung Clara's nose. "You're not. You're here to clean, to stay invisible, to keep your place." Clara folded a sheet slowly, her hands steady. "I think I'm here to do my job. And right now my job is making sure that boy remembers there's a world outside that ceiling he stares at." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You're playing a dangerous game, Bennett. One slip and you're out. Permanently." Clara met her gaze without flinching. "Then I'll make my moves count." That afternoon, while the house settled into its usual post-lunch quiet, Clara returned to Ethan's room with a purpose. She moved the small toy car to the far edge of his side table, just far enough that he would have to reach for it. Then she sat back and waited. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the car. His fingers twitched. Slowly, haltingly, his arm began to rise. The movement was awkward, shaky, but it was his. Clara leaned forward, her voice soft but urgent. "That's it, baby. You can do it." The car tipped, clattered to the floor, and rolled under the bed. Ethan's lips parted in frustration, another spark of something real. Clara bent down, retrieved the car, and placed it in his hand again. This time his fingers closed around it faster, tighter. What Clara didn't know was that, down the hall, Jonathan had stepped out of his office to get a cup of coffee. And as he passed the east wing, he stopped just short of the doorway, hidden from sight. He heard her voice, low and steady, urging his son forward. He heard the scrape of the car across the wood, and then he heard it, another tiny laugh. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the crack in the door, caught between the instinct to shut this down and the dawning realization that something extraordinary was happening right under his roof. The headlines hit before anyone in the Drake estate could brace for impact. Billionaire's silent son takes first steps, Maid at the center of miracle or manipulation, splashed across a gossip blog in jagged blacks. Letters beneath a grainy photo of Ethan standing by his bed. Clara crouched just a foot away. The image had been taken from outside through the narrow gap in the curtains. The angle was voyeuristic, the lighting poor, but it was enough to ignite a storm. By the time the staff awoke that morning, the gates at the end of the long drive were choked with news vans. Camera lenses jutted like rifle barrels from behind fences and parked cars. Reporters shouted questions at anyone who so much as came near the iron bars. Jonathan saw it from his upstairs office window, coffee in hand, the steam curling against the glass. He felt the knot in his stomach tighten with every camera flash. Across the desk, his phone buzzed with calls from his publicist and 3 members of his board. The words were always the same: liability, Optics. Control the narrative before it controls you. He ignored them and called Victoria into the room. Who took that photo? His tone was flat, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. She hesitated just a fraction too long. The source isn't confirmed, but you did it, Jonathan said, or you know exactly who did. Her mouth tightened, but she said nothing. Down in the East Wing, Clara was unaware of the storm brewing outside. She was kneeling by Ethan's wheelchair, adjusting the blanket on his lap. "You're warm enough?" she asked. Ethan nodded, his eyes brighter than they'd been in months. Patricia entered, closing the door behind her. "There's media outside. A lot. They know about the steps." Clara froze for just a moment. "Does your father know?" she asked Ethan gently. "He's mad, isn't he?" Ethan's voice was small but steady. Before Clara could answer, the door opened sharply. Jonathan stood there, still in his black suit, his tie knotted with the precision of habit. His eyes flicked from Clara to Ethan. "Did you do this?" His voice was as low, dangerous. Clara stood. "If you mean did I call the press, no, I would never. Someone leaked a photo of my son standing, and now there's a feeding frenzy at the gates. The board is demanding answers. They think I'm allowing, whatever this is, to happen without oversight. They think you're experimenting on him." Ethan's small hand gripped the armrest of his chair. "Not Mavis," he caught himself, corrected. "Not Clara. She's helping me." Jonathan didn't look at him. His jaw worked as though chewing back words he didn't trust himself to say. Finally, he turned on his heel and left, the echo of his footsteps sharp in the hall. Clara exhaled slowly, then crouched again in front of Ethan. "Whatever happens, we keep working," she said. "One step at a time." But outside, the storm was growing. By mid-afternoon, a black town car rolled up the driveway, cutting through the reporters like a blade. Out stepped Richard Gaines, Jonathan's oldest business partner and a board member, with a reputation for smiling as he stuck in the knife. Gaines didn't even glance at the cameras. He walked straight inside and into Jonathan's office. "I warned you sentiment would sink you," Gaines said, tossing a printed copy of the blog onto the desk. "Pull the plug on this Maid before the market opens tomorrow, or you'll be looking at an emergency vote to remove you as CEO." Jonathan didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted to the grainy image, Ethan on his feet, Clara nearby, her hands hovering just enough to catch him if he fell. There was determination in the boy's face, the kind Jonathan hadn't seen since before the accident. "You have until tonight," Gaines said, breaking his thoughts. "After that, the choice will be made for you." As the door shut behind him, Jonathan sat back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders like coiled wire. His instinct was to protect Ethan from the chaos, to slay from every door and window until no sound from outside could seep in. But shutting out the world meant shutting out the one person who seemed able to reach his son. Downstairs, Clara went about her duties as though nothing had changed, but her senses were heightened, aware of the sideways glances from other staff. She could feel the tension in the air like static before a storm. That night, as the mansion settled into its habitual hush, Jonathan found himself walking toward the East Wing without deciding to. The door to Ethan's room was slightly ajar, and through the gap he saw Clara kneeling on the floor, guiding Ethan as he gripped the edge of the bed frame. The boy was trembling from the effort, but his face was set in fierce concentration. "You can do it," Clara whispered. "I'm right here." Jonathan's hand rested against the doorframe, his breath caught between pride and fear. If Gaines and the board saw this, they'd call it reckless. If the public saw it, they'd call it a miracle. And for the first time in years, Jonathan realized he had no idea which side he was on. The morning after the photo leak, the Drake estate felt less like a home and more like a fortress under siege. The press still clogged the gates, their voices carrying faintly up the long driveway. Security had doubled, but it wasn't enough to keep the world out. The tension in the air was thick, brittle, ready to snap. Jonathan was in the middle of a tense conference call with his legal team when Charles, the head butler, entered the office without knocking. "Sir," he said, his voice low, "there are guests in the formal sitting room who insist on seeing you immediately." Jonathan frowned. Send them away. I don't have time for it's your in-laws, Charles interrupted. The words landed like a punch to the chest. Jonathan hadn't seen Margaret and Harold Ashford since the funeral. They had vanished, shed into their own grief, retreating to Europe for privacy. Now, after 2 years of silence, they were here, and they had brought lawyers. Jonathan straightened his tie, smoothed the front of his suit, and walked to the sitting room. The Ashfords looked every inch the wealthy patricians they were. Margaret in a steel gray suit and pearl earrings, Harold standing stiff by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. A man in a pinstripe suit sat between them, a sleek leather briefcase at his feet. Jonathan, Margaret said coolly, we've been following the news. Imagine our shock to learn from tabloid photographs that our grandson is apparently walking and that his recovery is being overseen by a domestic employee. Her name is Clara Bennett, Jonathan replied evenly, and she's done more for Ethan than anyone in a white coat has managed in 2 years. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Drake, my clients are concerned for Ethan's welfare. They believe you've allowed an unqualified individual to engage in experimental therapy, which may endanger him physically and psychologically. Therefore, they are petitioning for custody. Jonathan's jaw tightened. You're trying to take my son? We are trying to protect him, Harold said, his voice deep and unyielding. Ethan needs specialists, not sentiment. Not someone playing at miracles to ease your guilt. The mention of guilt hit its target, but Jonathan didn't flinch. Where were you when he couldn't speak? When he wouldn't eat? When he lay in bed for months without moving? You want to talk about protection? You abandoned him. Margaret's nostrils flared. We lost our daughter. Forgive us if we weren't eager to watch you replace her with the help. Before Jonathan could respond, a quiet voice cut through the tension. Mavis, Clara, didn't replace Mommy. They all turned. Ethan stood in the doorway, his legs braced but straight, one hand gripping the doorframe for balance. Clara was behind him, her hands hovering but not touching. His gaze was steady, his voice soft but clear. She makes me try, he said. She makes me feel alive. You don't even know me. Margaret's face paled. Ethan, sweetheart, you can't take me away from Daddy and Clara, he said firmly. I don't want to go. Harold stepped toward him, but Clara shifted slightly, her presence calm but protective. That's enough for today, she said gently, guiding Ethan back toward his room. The Ashford's lawyer gathered his papers. We'll let the court decide what's in his best interest. The moment they were gone, Jonathan followed Clara to the east wing. She was settling Ethan into bed when he closed the door behind him. They'll drag you through court, Jonathan said. They'll paint you as some manipulative savior, and they'll use every second of progress you've made as evidence that I'm reckless. Clara didn't look up from tucking the blanket around Ethan. Then we show them the truth. Every step he's taken, every laugh, every word. We show them that love and persistence work when sterile rooms and silence fail. Jonathan studied her, torn between fear and admiration. If we fail, we won't, Clara said, her voice quiet but resolute. Later that night, alone in his office, Jonathan stared at the custody petition spread across his desk. Outside, he could hear faint music drifting from the east wing. Clara's humming, low and steady, and in the background, a sound he still wasn't used to, his son's soft, unguarded laughter. For the first time in years, Jonathan wondered if maybe, just maybe, the fight ahead was one worth having. The rain came down in thin, silvery sheets the morning of the court-ordered observation. The sky was a bruised gray, the kind that promised more storms, and inside the Drake estate, every room hummed with a quiet, strained energy. This was the day the judge would see Ethan in person, not in a sterile courtroom, not in photographs, but here, in his own space. Jonathan had been up since before dawn, pacing his office with a cup of coffee he never drank. His legal team had prepped him relentlessly. Be composed, don't let emotions take over, don't antagonize the Ashfords. He could do that in business. He wasn't so sure he could do it when the stakes were his son. In the East Wing, Clara moved methodically through her morning routine, though she felt the tension in her own shoulders. She dressed Ethan carefully in a soft blue sweater and dark trousers, brushing his hair until it lay neatly. "We're not here to perform," she told him quietly. "We're just going to show her who you are." Ethan nodded, but there was a determination in his eyes that didn't belong to a child who planned to just sit still. By 10 o'clock, Judge Evelyn Hart arrived with her clerk, escorted through the side entrance to avoid the media still camped outside. She was a tall woman with iron gray hair pulled into a severe twist, her dark suit immaculate. But there was a softness in her eyes that caught Clara's attention immediately. This was not a woman easily swayed by theatrics, but one who noticed the small things. The Ashfords were already in the drawing room with their attorney, perfectly composed and ready to make their case. Judge Hart, however, made it clear that she wanted to start in the East Wing. "I'd like to see Ethan in a familiar setting," she said. When they entered his room, Ethan was seated in his wheelchair by the window, sunlight breaking through the rain clouds and spilling across the floor. Clara stood beside him, a quiet pillar of presence. Jonathan was just behind them, hands in his pockets to hide how tightly they were clenched. "Hello, Ethan," Judge Hart said warmly. "May I sit with you?" Ethan nodded. She sat across from him, notepad untouched. "Your grandparents tell me they're very worried about you." Ethan's eyes shifted toward Margaret and Harold, then back to the judge. "They don't know me," he said softly, "but Clara does, and Daddy does now, too." The judge tilted her head. "And how has Clara helped you?" "She believed I could get better," Ethan said, "even when I didn't." The room was silent except for the soft patter of rain against the window. Then Ethan looked at Clara. "Can we show her?" Clara crouched to meet his eyes. "If you want to, baby." Jonathan felt his heart climb into his throat as Ethan pushed himself forward out of the chair, gripping the armrest for balance. His legs trembled, but he stayed upright. One step, then another. Clara kept her hands hovering close, ready to catch him if he faltered, but she didn't touch. The judge watched, her face unreadable, as Ethan took a third step, and then a fourth. When his knees finally buckled, Clara caught him gently, lowering him back into the chair. Ethan's chest rose and fell with the effort, but he was grinning, a real wide grin that made him look like a different child entirely. "That's extraordinary," Judge Hart murmured. Margaret's voice broke in, sharp with desperation. "It's dangerous. This is exactly what we mean. He's being pushed too hard." "No," Ethan said, his voice clear. "I'm pushing myself." Judge Hart closed her notebook without writing a single word. "I've seen enough." The Ashfords stiffened, but the judge didn't elaborate. Instead, she turned to Jonathan and Clara. "I'll deliver my decision to the court tomorrow. Until then, maintain his cue, rent routine." When they left, Jonathan stayed behind in the East Wing. He knelt beside Ethan's chair, his voice rough. "You were incredible today." Ethan's small hand found his. "We're not done yet, Daddy. We still have to win." Jonathan looked up at Clara. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes held that same unshakable fire she'd had since the day she arrived. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan knew, deep down, without doubt, they just might. The day of the verdict dawned crisp and bright, as if the storm that had hung over the Drake estate for weeks had finally blown itself out. But inside the mansion, no one felt relief yet. The court had called them back downtown. Today, Judge Evelyn Hart would decide whether Ethan Drake stayed in his father's home or was taken away. Jonathan stood in front of his dressing mirror, fastening his cufflinks with hands that weren't as steady as he wanted them to be. He had been through hostile takeovers, corporate collapses, and boardroom wars, but this was different. This was the fight that mattered. This was his son. Down the hall, Clara was helping Ethan button his small navy blazer. "You look like a young gentleman," she said softly. Ethan grinned, but there was a shadow behind it. "What if she says I have to go?" he asked. Clara crouched to meet his eyes. "Then you'll know we did everything we could. But I don't think she will. You showed her the truth." The courthouse steps were a gauntlet of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Security ushered them inside quickly, but not before Ethan squeezed Clara's hand tighter. The Ashfords were already seated at their table, their lawyer leaning in with quiet, confident whispers. Margaret didn't meet Jonathan's eyes. Harold, however, watched him like a man who believed victory was already in his grasp. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. She began without preamble. I have reviewed all testimony, evidence, and my own observations from our recent in-home visit. The central question before this court is whether Ethan Drake's current living arrangement serves his best interest. Jonathan felt Clara's shoulders stiffen beside him. I witnessed remarkable progress in Ethan, Judge Hart continued. Progress that was not driven by traditional therapy alone, but by a consistent emotional connection, by trust, encouragement, and stability. She glanced briefly toward Clara. Such connection is as critical to a child's well-being as any medical intervention. Margaret's lips thinned. Therefore, the judge said, her voice firm, I deny the petition for custody. Ethan Drake will remain in his father's care, with Ms. Clara Bennett continuing in her current role as part of his daily support team. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Ethan turned to Clara with a grin so wide it seemed to light his whole face. Jonathan let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I encourage both parties to work toward rebuilding a healthy relationship. Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, you are granted regular visitation, contingent on maintaining a supportive environment for your grandson. Margaret's composure cracked. We just wanted what was best for him, she said quietly. Then start by knowing him, Ethan replied from his seat, his voice clear in the hushed courtroom. Outside, the media swarmed, but this time the tone was different. The story was no longer miracle or manipulation. It was about a family's fight to stay together. Supporters had gathered with signs. Believe in Ethan, love heals, Team Clara. Back at the estate that evening, the tension that had gripped the house for so long was gone. Music drifted from the kitchen where Rosa was baking cookies. Charles had taken Ethan to the garden to show him the first spring blooms. Jonathan found Clara alone in the terrace light, staring out at the city. You saved him, Jonathan said. Clouds. Clara shook her head. He saved himself. I just kept reminding him he could. Jonathan stepped closer. Stay, not just as his caregiver. Stay as part of this family. She looked at him for a long moment. You know I will. The next morning, the front page wasn't about scandal. It was a photograph of Ethan, walking across the garden lawn, sunlight on his face, Clara at his side. The caption read, The Boy Who Walked Again. Inside the Drake estate, life moved forward, but no one forgot the battle it took to get here. And every night, when Clara passed the east wing, she still hummed that old gospel tune. And every night, without fail, Ethan's head would turn toward the sound.